Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this webinar today. My name is Rama Kurdemi. I am the Director of Grassroots Organizing at the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, which is a national coalition of groups working together for freedom, justice, and equality. We're very honored for all of you to join us today on World Refugee Day for this No Bans on Stolen Lands webinar, which is actually the first webinar we are hosting as part of our Together We Rise, Palestine as a Model of Resistance education series in order to strengthen liberation struggles from across the U.S. to Palestine. I'm also honored today to be joined by Kafi Ahmed, who's a Somali-American organizer in Minneapolis, and Bimna Shumali from the Bazil Resource Center for Residency and Refugee Rights. I'm going to start off our webinar today and then pass it on to our other presenters. So in honor of World Refugee Day, just thinking about some numbers of how many refugees there are worldwide. Today there are 22.5 million refugees, 55% of those refugees coming from 3 countries, Syria, Afghanistan, and South Sudan alone. And the refugee crisis over the past few years has gotten varying degrees of media attention and really and at different times and different points. And so within weeks of Trump's inauguration here in the U.S. Back in January, it did become an issue again as he started putting into place all of the racist policies he had been openly advocating for, fulfilling the campaign promises he was elected to do. This obviously included the Muslim ban, which originally impacted immigrants, refugees, and travelers from 7 Muslim-majority countries: Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Iran, Somalia, and Sudan. And the impact of the ban was immediate. We had tens of thousands of visas that were revoked, U.S. Customs and Border Protection completely ignoring at times even court rulings telling them, no, this ban is not legitimate, held travelers at airports nationwide for countless hours, interrogated them about their politics, even asking them at times for access to their social media accounts. And there were countless numbers of families that were separated, students confused about what is going to be our future for our education, and refugee and asylum seekers, unfortunately, even further traumatized. While both versions of the Muslim ban have at this point been challenged in the courts and have been ruled against by different courts across the U.S., its impact continues. People, are afraid to even travel, not knowing if they might be traveling, and then Trump decides to put out another executive order around the Muslim ban, and then they're going to be left in limbo. So the horror of the Muslim ban has been intense, but I also want us to think about the resistance that we saw coming out against the Muslim ban and how we can take that as inspiring. People protested at airports nationwide. Lawyers and activists organized to ensure that the impacted individuals had the support they needed in the languages they spoke. Even politicians were protesting such a blatantly Islamophobic policy. I mean, even politicians, for example, here in D.C. go to the Dulles airport and stand in solidarity with the people who the Customs and Border Patrol were actually were interrogating. More specifically in D.C., I was part of a group that formed after Trump was elected called the D.C. Justice for Muslims Coalition, and where we were organizing protests around U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and urging also local council members to speak out against the Muslim ban. So thinking about how we're taking these national things that are happening nationally and really bringing them to a local level and understanding that there are local ways that we can protest and resist these policies. We also, though, really use this as an opportunity to expand the conversation by holding political education events about the bigger issues of structural Islamophobia in the U.S. that the Muslim ban exposed. So it was great that there was so much outrage against this one specific Trump policy. The reality is that this was just the latest iteration of so many U.S. policies that have been targeting Muslims under this greater war on terror framework, which we all know George W. Bush launched in 2001. Obama expanded it under his presidency, and now Trump is further entrenching this war on terror. And it seems like the default in a lot of the discussions around the Muslim ban was that Trump is doing something new, something that is not normal for the United States. And the reality, though, is obviously different, that Muslims and obviously other groups, and we'll get into that, have been facing oppressive policies from the state for so long. So specifically on the war on terror, since I think that's been a lot of what the focus, what's been impacting Muslims for the past 16 years, the war on terror has targeted Muslims worldwide through policies like torture, unlawful imprisonment at Guantanamo and CIA black sites. We've had examples of preemptive prosecution, people being prosecuted for their thought crimes versus actually doing anything legally wrong, registries and deportations, FBI entrapment, and countering violent extremism programs that were meant to criminalize Muslims. And then most closely connected to the Muslim ban, we had the U.S. Invasions and occupations and bombing campaigns of the past 16 years. So, in 2016 alone, Obama dropped 26,000 bombs on 7 Muslim majority countries, all in the name of fighting terrorism. 5 of those countries were included in the Muslim ban. So there are very clear conditions that people coming to the U.S. Were fleeing from, whether they were U.S. bombs, brutal regimes, or famines, and unfortunately in some places like Syria, all that and so much more. Yet this analysis was oftentimes left out of the conversations, leaving unchallenged the notion that what Trump was doing was out of line with what the U.S. has been doing for decades. And obviously, when we're talking about U.S. relationships, U.S. treatment of Black people, of indigenous people since the day it was founded. The fact that thousands of mostly Muslims, for example, have been slaughtered by U.S. bombs in the past few months in places like Syria and Iraq, where the U.S. is even using white phosphorus there, as Trump is fulfilling yet another campaign promise to annihilate ISIS and take out their families. And we're not seeing that same outrage and that same anger that we saw with the Muslim ban. Highlights that there's a disconnect, that people were concerned with what Trump was doing in terms of turning away Muslims from our borders, and yet we're not thinking, well, what's happening when these people are turning away or the ones who aren't making it to our borders. This lack of analyzing the Muslim ban through a wider lens of the war on terror, the history of Islamophobia in the U.S., and looking at it as a transnational issue has also, for example, allowed people who we identify in Palestine circles as progressives except for Palestine, or who are liberal Zionists, to present themselves as allies against the fight against Islamophobia, when they are oftentimes completely supportive of, say, for example, Israel's own policies that are targeting Palestinians. And so we have anti-Palestinian groups like the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, the Jewish Council on Public Affairs, and others came out and openly condemned Trump's ban and said, we stand with refugees, we stand with our Muslim neighbors. And these groups for so long have refused to grapple with the role that they and other pro-Israel groups play in perpetuating Islamophobia in order to justify Israel's denial of Palestinian rights. I want to recommend 2 things for people to look into, and I'll add links into the chat box. The International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network has a report called The Business of Backlash and the Attack on the Palestinian Movement and Other Movements for Social Justice, as well as Jewish Voice for Peace has their Network Against Islamophobia curriculum, which both have really great connections between pro-Israel groups and individuals with the greater Islamophobia industry, and how support for Israel is premised around very racist notions like Israel being the only democracy in like a barbaric jungle. And we're even seeing like groups, and again, another example, so like this week, J Street, which again we would consider politically to be liberal, is marking World Refugee Day. And yet when you go on their website, the way they talk about Palestinian refugees, they refer to them as flooding Israel. And that's, again, dehumanizing language to describe Palestinian refugees in order to help Israel deny their rights. And these pro-Israel groups are putting out these statements in support of refugees while actively supporting Israel's denial of Palestinian rights, and specifically Palestinian refugee rights returning home. So that today there are like over 7 million Palestinian refugees, which again, the next largest refugee population is Syrians at 5.5 million. So we're talking about a larger number, and one that's been decades long now waiting to return home. And we see that, you know, when we think about the outrage around the refugee crisis today, thinking about the reactions of like people when we have children drowning in the Mediterranean Sea, because European countries who, you know, are acting like we're so much better than Trump, and yet they themselves have enacted a refugee ban for years. You know, there's outrage, so we know people have feelings to refugees and say, yeah, we want to support. Well, how can we support them? And yet when Palestinian refugees are denied their fundamental rights for decades, their camps are attacked, they're bombed, put under siege. The latest example, obviously, what Palestinian refugees in Syria are going through, and oftentimes being forced to become refugees for second and even third times. It's really hard to take people's concerns with the greater refugee crisis if they're so adamant that the Palestinian refugee crisis is not something worth their time or energy, or even they actively work against Palestinian refugees. And frankly, sometimes the solution to Palestinian refugee problem is much more easier to conceive. I'm not saying it's easier to implement, but it's easier to conceive in terms of they have their right is there enshrined in international law that they have a right to return their homeland. So I think I'm going to wrap up here, but just to think in terms of why this is so important, like, and I reflect back in terms to make these connections, like why is it important when we're talking about the Muslim ban that we think about how it connects to Palestine, and we're talking about Palestine, how it connects to U.S. Islamophobic policies. So like some of the chants that we were singing at airport protests, from Mexico to Palestine, all the walls have got to go, from Palestine to the Philippines, stop the U.S. war machine, no ban, no registry, no white supremacy. Or we should think about the title of this webinar itself, No Bans on Stolen Lands. These are all great chants that force us to start thinking, okay, what does it mean to actually dissect what we're saying in order to figure out how we can actually take on the full extent of what we need to do in order that we are all free. So thank you all so much. I'm going to turn it over to Safia now.
Sorry, give me one sec. I just had to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Rama, for that introduction and for all that excellent information. So my name is Kafi Ahmed. I'm an activist and organizer in Minneapolis in the Somali American community here. The Somali diaspora community in Minneapolis is the largest outside of Somalia. The community's been here for about 25 years. And in the last, I would say, post 9/11 years, I guess that's how Muslims measure time these days. Since 9/11, the community has kind of been the epicenter of what I would call like the U.S. government's domestic experimentation on Muslim communities. So a lot of the programs and ideas of the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and now the Trump administration has occurred within this community. The community exists at this really tenuous and violent intersection of xenophobia, anti-Blackness, Islamophobia, and it's an intersection, and also class warfare, considering that this community is a Black immigrant community. The vast majority of the community are refugees, and we live in a state that is majority white, majority liberal, or what have you, progressive. So one of the main things that I'm going to touch on is what's called the Countering Violent Extremism program, because I think this program kind of highlights how these things intersect in a institutional capacity. So the program, for those of you that don't know, is a pet project of the White House and the Obama administration. It was first implemented, or the idea was first brought about 2011, 2012 with a White House summit, and at that summit, many people from the Somali American community in Minneapolis were invited to attend at the behest of the president and asked to kind of contribute to the conversation about what does a government incursion into preventing radicalization look like. The program started by, I think some of you may remember Representative Peter King, who had, yes, Peter King from Long Island. I mixed him up with the other Representative King, who's also a massive racist, who had these essentially like Cold War era, like Muslim hearings in Congress, where he was asking, like, what is the level of radicalization? And at the time, the Somali community was reeling from the information that 20 or so boys had returned to Somalia to fight what the government was calling in a holy war. The Somali community understands it to be the young men went to the country to fight against Ethiopian invasion into Somalia. Anyway, so that was kind of the precipice of this conversation that was happening. And it wasn't until about 2 or so years later, 2013, 2014, that this program kind of started to blossom into what it would become, like the most effective version of itself. The program is based predominantly on a British program called the Prevent program, which has the same kind of intention, right? It's to prevent radicalization. Mind you, there is no any thinker, intellectual, anyone who has kind of ever done research on this issue will tell you that there is no way to kind of predict these thought crimes. The FBI's own report in 2015 stated that there is no preliminary indicator of radicalization, and in fact, there was no way for them to know until after it happened. So a lot of the conversation for those of us that work on this issue has been, why has this program found itself to be so successful in this community in particular? Minneapolis is one of 3 pilot cities. The other 2 are Boston and Los Angeles. And of the 3 total cities, Minneapolis is the only one that has kind of had, you know, any kind of success. And it far surpassed the other 2 as a model of what CVE can look like. It is a kind of a relationship building apparatus between the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, the White House during the Obama administration, and in the city, everything from social services to mentoring to the public schools are involved in this project. When we think about why the program has been able to infiltrate so many aspects of our community, we think about the way that this community exists. Like I said, the vast majority live far below the poverty line. The vast majority are refugees. The vast majority are English language learners, and kind of are a community that has really staunchly held on to our communal ways of living from Somalia, a community that has, even in the midst of the cold Minnesota tundra, decided that we will, you know, be as Muslim as possible and not really live in fear or pushed out of our religious practice or our cultural practice. And this really highlights for me, as someone who works as a Somali refugee myself, someone who was born in Somalia and grew up in the United States, I've kind of borne witness to this, these intersections, right? For a long time, I worked on issues of anti-Blackness, and in those spaces, Muslims were not talked about as kind of recipients of anti-Black hatred. There was especially like Muslim refugees or African Muslims, and then I would be in Muslim spaces, and that wasn't talked about as a kind of potential issue, right? Like anti-Blackness and confronting anti-Blackness in Muslim communities. So it's only been, honestly, in the last 2 or so years that these conversations have finally started to merge into larger conversations of oppression, of hatred, and thinking about the ways in which anti-Blackness, Islamophobia, institutional bigotry, the kind of like the destruction of native lands, the U.S. war machine, and, you know, kind of like how refugees are created, all of these conversations are kind of being melded into a larger conversation about what that kind of what that hatred looks like and what that means for those of us who are impacted and those who live within those intersections. A great deal of conversation has been happening in the Somali diaspora community between British Somalis, American Somalis, Canadian Somalis, Somalis all over the world, because we are kind of interacting with these things all at once, and working in solidarity and in brotherhood and sisterhood with our our brothers and sisters who are also Muslims, who are also refugees, who kind of have to deal with these similar issues, but also confronting the issues that exist of anti-Blackness in those communities has been one of the key facets of finding a effective way of moving forward, right? It's my personal belief that until we, as Muslim communities, as communities that are not easily identifiable as Black, until we confront anti-Blackness, that there will be very little success in terms of like how we can build a movement. And in communities that work on anti-racist spaces, we also have to confront a culture of Islamophobia that has been inherited by the U.S. government's rhetoric towards Muslims, both domestically and internationally. So kind of the main bulk of my work has been trying to figure out how to confront all of these issues. I have a document that goes into like greater detail. It's a one-pager myself and several other activists in the community here created that I can send around to everybody. It's kind of very like detailed point by point, the creation and sustaining of CVE and programs like it. So if anybody has questions, I'll be happy to take them later, and then I'll also ask Rama to send this around to everyone later.
Thank you so much, Kefia. I'm going to turn it over to Lubna and just remind people again that you can be submitting questions through the questions panel. And I've been chatting in some links. I'll chat in some links as well. We'll send out what Kefia has, but I'll chat some links around CVE as well.
Thank you both, Kefia and Rama, for both your interventions. Very enlightening, very powerful. In terms of the Palestinian situation or context, as Rama said, the Palestinian refugee and internally displaced persons population numbers about almost 8 million. That is refugees and IDPs. We are still, despite the huge crisis in Syria and the great number of Syrian refugees fleeing Syria, we are still the largest and longest standing displaced population in the world. When we go back to the roots of the conflicts, we see and we continue to see that we can talk about white supremacy and we can talk about Islamophobia within the Palestinian context. Because the conflict, how it is presented by Israel, in certain times it's presented as a religious conflict, when in reality it's really not a religious conflict. It's not about Jews versus Muslims, but rather it's about a movement, a political movement, which is Zionism, that had a colonial and white supremacy kind of background, originating from Europe by well-to-do Europeans, white Europeans, who wanted to colonize Palestine. And they searched for a legitimate, let's say, not necessarily legitimate, but they searched for what they could do to propel this colonization, and how they could bring it about by convincing the international community that this is what needs to be done, and this is what we want to do, to kind of get the nod of approval from the international community. And so they had to go about delegitimizing and dehumanizing the other. In this case, we're talking about Palestinian Arabs in Palestine. At that time, before 1948, the Nakba, the Palestinian community was comprised of a majority of Muslims, but there were also Christians and Jews living in Palestine. But dehumanizing and demonizing the other to make sure that the international community would get on board with the forcible transfer of Palestinians out of Palestine and the colonization in their place with the newly desired population. And so who is this newly desired population? The Zionist movement in Israel says that this land is for the Jews, and so they say that the desired population are Jews from around the world. But when you look at the desirable Jew, or the desirable Jew in the eyes of Israel or in the eyes of the Zionist movement, you find that what they are searching for is a well-to-do European white Jew. And even an individual who may not necessarily be religiously Jewish, the preference is for individuals who are ethnically or identify as Jewish, but are basically secular or non-practicing Jews. So we can very intimately relate white supremacy with the situation in Palestine and the Zionist movement. And we can even think of Zionism as a form of white supremacy. And one of the things that the UN did in the past, and I apologize because I can't remember the year, but I believe it was maybe in the 70s or early 80s, they passed a resolution saying that Zionism is racism. And there was, of course, a big backlash on that resolution by Israel and members of the Zionist movement and pro-Israeli groups and pro-Zionist groups and so on and so forth. And so they had the UN remove the resolution, but it was conditioned on the fact that Israel, up until then, had refused to accept Ethiopian Jews who were Jews of color coming to Israel, who had petitioned Israel to exercise, to be able to come and live in Israel under the Israeli law of return. And up until that time, they had not allowed them to come. They had not granted them permission or granted them entry to Israel. And so the removal of that UN resolution was conditioned upon the fact that they would accept Ethiopian Jews, Jews of color, to come and live in Israel, and that they would grant them citizenship. So we can definitely see also that there is anti-blackness, Islamophobia presented within the Zionist movement and the Zionist ideology. The ways in which Israel keeps Palestinians from returning is that they create laws, much in the same way that Donald Trump is creating executive orders and decisions and so on and so forth. So if there's a situation that they want to rectify or address, they will create a law. And one of the things that my organization does, what Badil does, is we look at Israeli law and we compare it to international law to make sure that it complies. Unfortunately, we don't really have a form of redress like in the United States. So in the US, a law is passed, or a policy like this Muslim ban, and local communities, activists can go to their local governments, and they can go to their higher up governments like the district or the state, and then go to the federal government, and they can go through the court system and get the law to be declared unconstitutional or invalid and so on and so forth. However, we don't have that situation here. And so it's much more difficult for us. So what we do is we compare Israeli law to international law, and we raise our issues and concerns not to the Israeli courts, because they are already created in such a way that they are already, we are already at a disposition, or we are already poised to lose. And the reality is that the vast majority of cases that are taken to the Israeli courts by Palestinians are lost. About, let's say, I think the last statistic I saw was like 98% of cases that are tried in the Israeli military courts are lost. Even the ones that happen to make it through appeal and appeal and appeal and make it to the to the Israeli High Court. So whether it has to do with, for example, a home demolition or arbitrary arrest or detention, if it has to do with collective punishment, land confiscation, denial of residency, family unification, and all these things, it's very difficult to get a case won by a Palestinian within the Israeli courts. So anyways, to get back to my point, I did digress a little bit. How Israel prevents Palestinians from returning. Well, one of the ways in which they prevent Palestinians from returning is that the law of return itself, the Israeli law of return, not the international right of return, it's two different things. The Israeli law of return only allows you to return if you are Jewish. So it bases the right of return on what your religious denomination is. And so the state has to approve of your Jewishness or deem you to be Jewish in order to be able to return and live in Israel and avail yourself of the rights granted to you by the state. This is considered institutionalized discrimination by international law, or in other words, it's apartheid. When you put into law, international law, and give a right to a specific group of people based on their religion or based on the color of their skin or based on their sex or based on their gender and so on and so forth, this is considered apartheid. So that's one of the ways in which Israel prevents Palestinians from returning. And as I said, they're very good at creating laws to kind of suit their needs. So in 1954, they put into the Israeli law books the Prevention of Infiltration law, which is another law that keeps Palestinians from returning to Palestine or exercising their right of return independently of international support or a treaty, a real treaty that would allow them to exercise their rights or international backing. While the Prevention of Infiltration law came onto the Israeli law books in 1954, it was actually in practice much before that time. So after Israel ethnically cleansed Palestine, Zionist movement, and then Israel ethnically cleansed Palestine in 1948, and there was a cessation of armed conflict. Israel declared itself to be an independent state, or declared its existence on Palestine, and the conflict, or the armed conflict between Palestinian resistance and the Zionist militias stopped. Thousands of Palestinians attempted to return. They wanted to check on their loved ones. The narratives, as the narrative goes, they took their keys and what they could carry on their backs, and they left, thinking that as soon as the fighting stopped, they would be allowed to return. And so thousands of them did attempt to return. But the Prevention of Infiltration law states that anyone attempting to enter Israel illegally will be deemed an infiltrator, and this infiltrator will be dealt with in three ways according to the law. One is that they will be shot on sight, and thousands of Palestinians who did attempt to return were shot on sight. The second provision is that they would be arrested and detained for 2-year sentences that could be renewed at the whim of the state, and thousands more were arrested and detained for 2-year terms that were renewed. And the third provision is that they would be arrested and forced back into exile. And so thousands more were arrested and forced back into exile. So why did Israel create the Prevention of Infiltration law? Why did it have it in practice even before it was actually put onto the Israeli law books? Well, they had a very embarrassing situation during that time in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And they had just expended all this energy to get Palestinians out of Palestine. It would kind of defeat the purpose to let them back in. And so they created the Prevention of Infiltration law in order to halt this Palestinian return, and in order to save face with the international community and make it appear as if they were actually as you had said, Rabah, the only democracy in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. The prevention of infiltration law in more recent times has been expanded to others as well. So when Israel did not want to receive any Somalian refugees, they used the prevention of infiltration law to keep them out of Israel. When we had the situation with the Sudanese refugees, they also used the prevention of infiltration law to keep them out. Or cited the prevention of infiltration law as the reason to keep them out. They also are starting to use the prevention of infiltration law against internationals. So I don't know if you heard, but like the director of Human Rights Watch recently, I think it was a couple months ago, was denied a visa to come into Israel. And the reason cited was that he was coming in and doing, this wasn't actually cited by officials, but it was understood that the reason they didn't want him there is because he was doing a lot of work documenting human rights violations and crimes against the Palestinian people by Israel. But they ended up using the prevention of infiltration law, saying that he was an infiltrator and he was not going to be there lawfully or be allowed to be there lawfully. So the expansion of the use of the prevention of infiltration law, not just to Palestinians, it gives Israel the ultimate decision to decide who is legal and who is illegally entering Israel. If we're going to talk about who is legally or illegally entering Israel, we have the law of nationality and state succession, which is one of the frameworks of international law, which states that any country, any succession of one government to the other or a country to another, that succeeding country or the country coming into power has to grant full citizenship and nationality to the existing indigenous population. But what the Zionist movement in Israel did is that they forced the Palestinians out. When they attempted to return, they did not allow them to return. And they would not allow them to gain nationality and citizenship through the law of nationality and state succession, which they are obliged to do by international law. And I'll stop there so that maybe we can either take questions or have a conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lubna and Kathy. And I think both your presentations really highlighted how a lot of times, you know, the law is being used to justify. And so a lot of times we think, well, yeah, governments in the end, they can't really pass things that are illegal, you know, that they'll be able to challenge things through the law system. And yet, you know, as Lubna is clearly, you're saying that this is enshrined in Israeli law that Palestinians cannot return home. And I think with a lot of the programs impacting Muslims in the U.S., there's also the legal backing to a lot of them. So, for example, when people were saying all across against that we're going to stand against Trump's Muslim registry, and this idea that, you know, there's no way this will happen, there's no way this will be allowed legally. Unfortunately, people have very short memory spans because right after 9/11, there was a Muslim registry that was implemented. It was called the NCERS program. You know, tens of thousands of people may have ended up, you know, being registering, and then it ended up having like around 13,000 people, it's estimated, were deported because of this program. And unfortunately, the program was actually never found illegal. Time and time again, it was challenged legally, and the courts would say no, it was okay, because technically it was never based on religious. It was always like, oh, national background and or security. So I wanted to actually pose a question to both of you in terms of when, you know, obviously people think legally that's the first step to resistance, but when that's not obviously going to be enough, what kind of other ways are we thinking about resistance from historically and or now? I know there's, you know, there's a lot of great things happening. So particularly to Palestinian refugees and what's going on in your specific Somali community. But yeah, can you give us some kind of insight on what other ways should we be thinking about challenging these unjust policies beyond the courts?
Yeah, I can go ahead. So a lot of, thankfully, our kind of, as a community and as like kind of the background I come from, a general skepticism of the government and its laws is healthy and considered kind of the operating mode. So a lot of the work we do is kind of outside of the legal system, right? So we have, with the Muslim bans, Somalia being one of the countries, we had, of course, like lawyers and translators and people like that to give people information about what this ban meant and how it would affect them in their lives. But we also were trying to find ways to protect people and communities, and we're giving people advice about how to kind of stay out of the sight of law enforcement and of the legal system and the apparatus. We've also been doing a lot of really wonderful conversations with formerly interned Japanese Americans who've been an amazing resource and like knowledge base for, I know, not just our community, but for a lot of Muslim communities and communities facing potential internment or government internment. And then there's a really vast, this is not necessarily in our community, but it's a system that I found that has been really amazing and effective, is that a lot of Antifa or anarchist communities in, particularly a good friend of mine is Greek, and then since the Greek austerity has taken place, a lot of kind of anarchist groups have come and served as service organizations, or kind of served in the place of the government, since the government can no longer be relied on to provide for its citizens. And I think that's kind of the place that we're in now. Unfortunately for us, that's the place we were in during the Obama administration, which a lot of people found to be kind of a good time for us as a community. It was a really dark 8 years filled with like an ever-increasing surveillance and entrapment. And so a lot of the fight for us is that we're, it's like the fight of information, making sure as many people are as informed as possible. And we're also taking on a more like digitally oriented approach to our activism and our work. We're, kind of taking digital security and protecting as many people as possible, both in the digital and in the real realm, seriously. So education has really been the key, and a lot of that is being done for free by community activists and groups. And I guess that's the one good thing about the Trump administration, is that people are taking these kind of measures a lot more seriously than they were during the 8 years of the Obama administration.
And can I just do a quick follow-up to Kafi before I pass it on to Livna? I'm curious if you would like to share. I know you all also locally were talking about not working with certain organizations who were being complicit through the CVE, so kind of not normalizing this idea of CVE, choosing to boycott these organizations. So if you want to share any on that.
Oh yeah, for sure. So like I was saying, the CVE program kind of has penetrated every aspect of life in the community here. And because we're a community that kind of runs on scarcity, a lot of local organizations have taken CVE funding under the guise of like preventing radicalization. So what we have done, along with this really fantastic youth group called the Young Muslim Collective and a few other kind of resistance groups, is create visuals and information packets for community members, organizations, and people who kind of want to do work in the Somali community. And we've told them that if you're going to do work in this community, then you don't take CVE funds. And you're asking like, who takes CVE funds and where are they coming from? And we kind of created imagery showing like every single organization who took CVE funding, every single group who's distributing CVE funding, every single kind of like prominent person in the community, whether Somali or not, who has participated in CVE in some way. And we've essentially told them that this is a poison pill, and that any kind of association with CVE in that manner will prevent you from being able to work with the community. And because it is a large but tight-knit community, it's been very simple to kind of distribute information about who has gotten CVE funding, and a lot of the community elders who are very respected and held in high regard have kind of called out other elders who've taken money, called out youth groups or any type of organization, and told people, like, we don't work with CVE organizations or CVE apparatuses. And so that's been a really fantastic outcome. It's been this like general boycott, so much so that people have spent a great deal of time lying about their affiliation to CVE. They understand that there's a shame associated with their participation. Unfortunately for them, there's something called the Freedom of Information Act. So we definitely know who got money and who didn't. So their lies are kind of falling on deaf ears. And it's been in the last kind of 6 months or so since the Trump administration took office, we've kind of started this transition, since CVE and now CIE, Countering Islamic Extremism, is taking hold, and it's become unpopular to work with the presidency. We have kind of started helping transition the former CVE organizations through this like a restorative justice and community, like a community reconciliation process through faith leaders and through other organizations. We're trying to get to a place where those who have previously participated in CVE are making amends and finding and using restorative justice practices to help them kind of transition out of CVE, create a reconciliation process with the community, and then like find modes of making sure that they no longer participate or never will participate in a program such as this in the future. So that's kind of our more long-term project that we're doing right now.
Fantastic. I definitely agree with you that education and awareness is key. I was one of the people that was completely unaware that deportations were going on during the Obama administration, and only recently discovered during a recent visit to the U.S. and was able to get some information on that and really understand that, because I think for me, speaking for myself, I had no clue, and I think that if we did have a clue and we did know, then we can first of all we can have an opinion about it, and collectively work together to put together activities and actions to fight this kind of thing. And then we can also get the word out to others. So I definitely think that education and awareness is key, and education and awareness is also key in order to propel civil society to act. So you also mentioned that working within the community, raising awareness about which organizations were taking funds from the CVE programs, who are the organizations complicit, and how they and who are the people involved that kind of had the perhaps in certain cases had the wool pulled over their eyes, thinking that this was going to be a program. They make these programs, of course, very appealing, and young people and so on and so forth, they want to join and that sort of thing, probably in neighborhoods where they are already marginalized and don't have that many services and programs being provided to them. It's very reminiscent for me of the normalization programs that are done by a number of so-called peace organizations. Bringing Israelis and Palestinians together to kind of, talk about their feelings and work things out, not kind of, shoving rights to the side, shoving freedoms to the side, and all the oppression that's been happening for, the past 70 years and so on and so forth, and expecting the situation to be resolved through programs that promote normalization and doing art for peace and doing yoga for peace and these kinds of things. So it reminds me of that. Of course, the boycott, doing boycott is one of the main tools available to civil society to resist. And definitely raising awareness about who is involved in human rights violations, or in the case of the CBE programs, who is involved, who's receiving funding, not allowing those organizations to work in the communities, not giving them access to individuals, having the community band together and resist and not participate in such things. Of course, is a great thing. And of course, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement or campaign of the Palestinian people is also making great strides. Sometimes for us, the information is a little bit harder to come by because it's kind of difficult to see which organizations and companies and so on and so forth are involved in corporate complicity in crimes or violations in Palestine in terms of the private corporations, but in terms of Israel and the Israeli government and Israeli products, and then of course the cultural boycott, the academic boycott, and the athletic boycott. Those are all venues for civil society to resist and to stop oppression and to raise awareness as well with the international community. So definitely those are venues that can be used, and it's not just the legal venues. Having said that, we firmly believe at Badil that we need to approach the situation, or we feel in the Palestinian situation, that it should be approached from both the legal venues as well as the civil society mobilization and movements like boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and also different types of awareness raising and attention grabbing type of activities like demonstrations and sit-ins and civil disobedience and so on and so forth. I'm going to turn on my light. Just noticed how dark I am.
So we're almost done. I'm going to ask people to sit down just 5 more minutes to see if there are any questions, any last-minute questions anyone want to ask, and either check them in or raise your hand like Anna had shown us at the start. They're just seeing if there's anything coming up. One question to Yuzna, and maybe this will be we'll close on this. Timothy just chatted, and the light reminded me, you know, about the electricity issues that are facing Gaza at this moment, and how, yeah, like if there's any latest updates related to what your work with people in Gaza around this.
Yeah, apparently in order to, I mean, of course it's a form of oppression and trying to squeeze more out of Gaza, or squeeze Gaza even further. And then of course there's the behind the scenes political goings on. But basically what's happening there is that because the PA doesn't want to pay for the electricity in Gaza, they, at the request of Israel, they suggested that they reduce the electricity being provided to Gaza. And as far as I know, it's going to be reduced by 40%. So on average now, Gaza receives in kind of like a circular, the electricity goes from location to location. So it's not all of Gaza's receiving electricity at the same time. So it's parts of of Gaza are receiving electricity, then it switches off here and it goes to another part, and so on and so forth. So they receive about, on average, of maybe like 4 to 5 hours of electricity per day. And I think it's being reduced to about 3.5 hours of electricity per day. So there's a significant decrease in electricity there. I think the intent is to further the Hamas-Fatah rift. There was a point a few years back when Hamas and Fatah were really discussing forming a unity government and ending the political fragmentation. And of course, Israel recognized this as a complete no-no, because then what would they have to present to the international community if they couldn't present, say that, you know, the Palestinians are fragmented, look, they've got this split government, they've got Hamas here, they've got Hamas in the West Bank, I'm sorry, they've got Hamas in Gaza, and they've got Fatah in the West Bank, and they can't even decide, they don't even know what, you know, what they want to do, and so on and so forth. And again, it's that white supremacy, or that colonial nature of showing the other as inferior. That's one part of it, but it's also to give Israel a talking point, because they can say, well, Hamas is a terrorist organization. Here we have that play of the war on terror and so on and so forth. And if Hamas joins with Fatah, then also Fatah has, you know, the unity government will be a terror organization. So they kind of stop that in their tracks, because then they wouldn't have a talking point in terms of Gaza. And so I think that the issue with the electricity is kind of like to increase that rift and isolate Hamas even more. And it also has to do with what's kind of going on in the region with Qatar as well. So now we have this shift, not necessarily shifting of sides, but we have these teams forming with Saudi Arabia and their pals, and then of course Qatar and Turkey and their pals. And again, it's a squeeze to kind of like try to show, or those who want to be in control kind of exert their control. In this case, of course, we're talking about Saudi Arabia, and then who, of course, Israel is with. I mean, so Israel is kind of like on the Saudi Arabia team, and then of course Turkey and Qatar. So they selected Turkey kind of to be the guinea pig, or not the guinea pig, but the scapegoat in this particular political play, saying that Qatar was supporting Hamas, when in actuality that's not really true. They are providing humanitarian aid and assistance to Palestinians in Gaza, but not necessarily supporting Hamas. So that's a little bit of that there.
Thank you so much, Signa, and thank you both, Signa and Katia, for being on today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I think it's really important that we ended on a note on Gaza. When we think about Gaza, you know, 70% plus of the population of Gaza is actually refugees. And when we're thinking about the greater context of what we're talking about when it comes related to Palestine, I know there was a lot of attention paid to this month being 50 years since the start of the occupation of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. But how do we kind of expand that conversation in terms of 2017? There's so many other anniversaries. We have 100 years since the Balfour Declaration that really kind of set the stage for support of the Zionist movement, that, you know, something was really the start of the colonization of Palestine. And then we have 70 years since the UN proposed a partition plan, which again set the stage for the actual ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And then we come to Gaza, 10 years of blockade, where it's very clear what the intent and purpose of Israel is from the start, and the Zionist project is really get rid of Palestinians and take as much land as possible. And I think it's very important that as we continue to talk about you know, the entirety of Israel as a settler colonial project, especially for us in the U.S., what that means, coming from ourselves, our own settler colonial history, and our own relationship to an indigenous population, that there was genocide against them, the fact that people were enslaved, Black people were enslaved to build this country, and more push kind of these connections and this intersectionality so that there is true collective liberation. So thank you all again so much. We're so happy that you were on our first webinar. I urge you to go to uscpr.org/Together We Rise, where we're going to be continuing to add resources and announcing future webinars. So have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.